I first talked about anesthesia, a way to understand consciousness, with Christoph. It was actually, I said, we got to figure out how anesthesia works. And he said, it's too nonspecific. It binds all over the body to everywhere. It's in fat stores, it's in proteins, it's in membranes, it's in lipid, it's everywhere. I said, yeah, but it's highly selective. It only affects consciousness and nothing else. He said, yeah, but it's too nonspecific. But it was a valid objection. That's a paradox. And about a few months ago, I think I figured it out. The anesthesia binds by these non-specific quantum forces. They go and they bind to everything. And yet the only thing they're affecting is consciousness. Why? The answer is
Stuart, let's dive straight into the deep end. I think that orchestrated objective reduction theory of consciousness is one of the most intriguing ones out there. And it's great that I have this opportunity to pick your brain. So let's start with some of the foundational aspects. How do you define consciousness? And let's perhaps do a brief summary of what OR theory is.
okay. Well, defining consciousness is not that easy. A brief apocryphal story is that there once was a consciousness conference who decided to define it on the first day and then explain it the rest of the week. And by the end of the week, they were still squabbling about the definition. So there are a lot of words, experience, qualia, phenomenal, subjectivity, first person, feelings, emotions. They're all part of it. You can have self-consciousness, but some kind of awareness, some kind of experience, as opposed to just having behavior. But from a scientific standpoint, I like to define it as what goes away with anesthesia and comes back when the patient wakes up. And I borrowed that from John Searle, who defined consciousness as what goes away with sleep, dreamless sleep, and comes back when you wake up. And fair enough, anesthesia is different because we can study it to see exactly what goes away with anesthesia to find the neural correlate of consciousness. So that's basically one of the approaches for consciousness. And you asked a brief overview of OR. So it starts with most people would say the brain is a complex computer of simple neurons. Simple meaning some kind of integrated logic, threshold logic device, integrate and fire. Hodgkin, Huxley, McCullough-Pitts worked out the physiology, but it's all at the membrane. It's all membrane channel receptors and channels opening and closing, and ions traveling across and getting a propagating electrical signals to move either analog or on the dendrites or digital in the axons, and that gives you a nice device for computer. Make a gazillion of those, hook them up with variable connections, and you have a self-organizing neural network type computer, which is what everybody assumes the brain is. And maybe it is, but that's not necessarily all it is. And that also doesn't explain consciousness, because a computer has an output, and then somebody has to look at the monitor to see the output. And so who's looking? That's the problem. So is consciousness just computation, or is there something else? And several ways to look at this. Dave Chalmers, when he defined the hard problem, was suggesting that it's something other than computation. Now he seems to have backtracked on that. Roger Penrose, of course, in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, said that using Gödel's theorem, that consciousness is more than, and conscious understanding is more than just computation, because you need an outside, like in Gödel's theorem, you need some outside system to validate or to judge the proof of a theorem, and in this case, to have the understanding of the meaning of something. So that was a different way of approaching it. And anyway, I got interested in microtubules when I was in medical school. In medical school, I was interested in the brain, mind, neurology, psychiatry, neurosurgery, but none of those lifestyles appealed to me. And my advisor, who was a hem-onc guy, suggested I just do research. Like he says, you might like it. And I'd never done anything like that, but it was a cancer lab, and they were studying mitosis, how the chromosomes divide and the daughter cells form. And everybody else got interested in the chromosomes because, genetic engineering was just starting. And but for some reason, I got interested in how these mitotic spindles made of microtubules seem to know where to go, which chromosome to grab, and pull them apart perfectly because if they weren't perfectly paired sets, you'd have malignancy or some kind of maldevelopment. And I still think that mitosis may be a cause of cancer, actually. And a lot of people think that too, aneuploidy or. But anyway, so at that time, the early 70s, it was also discovered that the same structures, microtubules, were in all cells, because prior to that, the fixative agent for electron microscopy was dissolving them for 30 years. So for 30 years, people thought the inside of cells was like a minestrone soup of stuff floating around. And then when they switched, a guy at Harvard, Keith Porter, switched from osmium tetroxide to glutaraldehyde, and all of a sudden they saw all this structure. And then they thought that was an artifact. So another couple of years, they argued back and forth, and finally, no, it's real. These are microtubules and other cytoskeletal structures. The cells, particularly asymmetrical cells like neurons, have to have something structurally supporting them. And their structure looked like a computer matrix. I was just learning about computers in a very rough way, and Boolean switching matrices and logic and all that. And neural nets were just beginning. And so I thought, well, maybe this is some kind of computer or molecular automata was actually the most correct term, because I work with some physicists who model them as cellular automata, with the cell being the individual state of the tubulin. So we developed all these models for information processing in microtubules. But I skipped over a step because on my way to describing the orco-arthur, in that after medical school, I moved out to Tucson, Arizona, where I still live, and went into anesthesiology, because the chair of the brand new anesthesia department at the brand new medical school said, you want to understand consciousness, figure out anesthesia. And you like microtubules? Here's a paper by a friend of mine in England that showed that halothane, an anesthetic, depolymerizes microtubules. And it was published in the Lancet, the #1 journal over there. Although it turned out it's 5 times as much as you need to go to sleep with. So depolymerization is not the answer, but it showed some kind of interaction. So I went in anesthesia because he said, it's right up your alley research-wise, and it's a lot of fun and it's good money. So here I am. I did 49 years of clinical anesthesia and just retired 6 months ago. And now I'm just doing a research purely in a slightly different area. But so I was going around to neural network meetings, being a real pain in the butt, saying, or AI meetings, that they were saying, okay, the singularity, for brain equivalence, for consciousness, you needed 100 billion neurons at maybe 1,000 synapses, 100 hertz, gives you 10 to the 16th operations per second for the whole brain. And there's about 1 billion tubulins per neuron. Switching at, say, 10 megahertz, that gives you 10 to the 16th operations per second per neuron, per single neuron. So I was going around being a real thorn in their side and saying, no, your target's way, way downstream. You're not even close. And you got to consider what's going on inside. And they said, no, you don't. Get out of here. You bother us, kid. I was sort of a kid then. Anyway, but one day somebody said, okay, Mr. Wise Ass, let's say you're right. And how does that explain consciousness? How does that explain feelings, love, joy, emotion? And I didn't know, and I was kind of stunned by the question, which is basically the hard problem before it was actually characterized by Dave, although other people had, Searle for one, had described it in other ways. And but I said, I don't know. And he said, you should read this book, by Roger Penrose, The Emperor's New Mind. And that was really a life-turning moment for me, because I did, and I didn't really understand the book totally, but I got that he was onto something about consciousness. And as I said, he used Gödel's theorem to prove that you need something else, and that through process of elimination had to be quantum physics and collapse of the wave function, and a particular type of collapse that he invented or discovered, which was the solution to the measurement problem. So he was solving, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, as they say. And of course, Dave criticized us for that when we teamed up, saying these guys are invoking a mythical law of minimization of mysteries. You got one mystery here, one mystery here. They must be the same mystery. And my answer is, well, why the hell not? And Occam's razor would suggest, if you have one solution to 2 grand mysteries. I'd throw in a third, actually, the origin of life, but maybe we'll come to that later. But anyway, I wrote to Roger. I read the book, and he needed some kind of quantum device in the brain, and he didn't know what it was. He just flat out said, "I have no idea." And so I wrote him a letter. I said, "Hey, it's microtubules." I mean, I was more polite than that. I said, I told him about microtubules, a book I had written, several articles, and I said, "By the way, I'm going to be in England in the fall. I'd be happy to come visit you." And he said, "Great." So I met him in his off. Well, he met me at the train station. We walked back to the Mathematical Institute, and we sat there for about 4 hours, during which I did 99% of the talking, because he just said, "Well, tell me about microtubules." And as you can tell, I like to talk about them. I haven't even gotten there yet, but he was very inquisitive. Well, he started off by saying that he was going to this conference at Cambridge on consciousness with philosophers Dan Dennett and Pat Churchland, two eliminative materialist philosophers who really were very they didn't want to hear anything about quantum or microtubules or anything. But anyway, but he said he was going there. I said, "Wow, that sounds like fun, but I got to go to this other meeting." So he shook my hand and said goodbye. I said, "Well, thank you. It was great to meet you." And I walked away thinking, well, gosh, I got to meet Roger Penrose. That was cool. And 2 weeks later, I was back in London, and my friend said, "Hey, I went to this conference at Cambridge, and Roger Penrose was talking about you and your microtubule thing." I said, "Wow." And that was another thrill. So soon after that, I got invited to a meeting that he was at in Sweden, and we started to team up, and I invited him to the first Tucson Consciousness Conference, and we cooked up this theory, orchestrated objective reduction. So as you may know, or probably know, objective reduction is Roger's solution to the measurement problem in quantum mechanics.
Mm.
And one of the things he did that is truly amazing is that unlike anybody else in this field, he dealt with the issue of how can we understand what a superposition is? How can something be in two places at once at the same time? What could that possibly mean? How do we grok that? And he used general relativity, and Einstein said that gravity or mass and caused space-time curvature was the same as space-time curvature, and that light behind the sun would bend around the sun and be visible on Earth during eclipse, so you wouldn't be blinded. So the light was actually bent. So Eddington did the experiment, proved him right. Eddington won his own Nobel Prize, and space-time is curved, and everybody knows that.
Yeah.
But that's for big things. What about tiny things? And Roger applied that to quantum particles, protons, electrons, and they could be in two states. What does it mean for them to be in two places at the same time? And he said, well, if each is a curvature in space-time, so a particle here is a curvature going this way, and the same particle over here is a curvature going this way, so that the superposition, whether the same particles here and here, is two curvatures, which is a separation in space-time geometry. And so it forces you to think that space-time is some kind of it's easy to conceive of it as a two-dimensional sheet, and he used these cartoons to do that, which were very helpful. And you had a curvature here, and you could see them separating. And I've always thought that, well, many people think there is no collapse, and each possibility continues in many worlds. And these separations, were they to continue, each would have its own universe, and you'd have many worlds and do it again and again. And a lot of people believe that's what happens. But Roger said the separations are unstable, and after a time t will collapse to one or the other. And here was the big kicker: there would be a moment of conscious experience, or proto-conscious experience. And that was because this collapse was the only thing that could give you a non-computable, non-classical computational answer or implication or effect on the collapse. It could influence it one way or the other. And that's what you needed for consciousness. And therefore, qualia and all experience must go along with it. Which was a bit of a leap, but I think a logical one, because I think you want all of that. You want non-computable selection, you want experience, and choice, free will, and so forth. So anyway, he didn't have a the collapse occurred at time t equals h bar over E sub G, which is the only equation in our theory. So where was I? So we teamed up, and he came to the first Tucson conference, and we started developing the theory. But before we had even had a manuscript, we were attacked by Pat Churchland and her grad student Rick Rush, who was making fun of it, and because of well, basically their argument was everybody knows it's ridiculous, and that's their argument. Everybody knows it. So, so they wrote this attack piece, and the first part of their article was about Gödel's theorem. It was very philosophical. I really couldn't follow it. The second part was about the biology of microtubules, and I think Pat must have assigned this to the poor graduate student. And his main argument was that there's a drug called colchicine that is used for gout.
Mm-hmm.
And gout is an inflammation of usually the big toe or some other joint because of uric acid crystal urate, and that causes irritation, inflammation, and the immune cells migrate into the joint. And once they're in, they release all these bradykinins and cytokines and all this stuff, and it causes an inflammatory response, causes swelling. The thing swells and it hurts like hell because it's in an enclosed space. And so the drug colchicine prevents microtubules from disassembling to then repolymerize. So an immune cell to go in this direction, if it's pointing over here, the microtubules disassemble and reassemble and go in that direction. And it prevents it from doing that. Therefore, the immune cells can't move. Therefore, there's no inflammation, cytokine release. Therefore, the pain goes away and everybody's happy. But they said, Rick and Pat said, well, all the microtubules in the brain, in the body would depolymerize, and you stay conscious. People with taking colchicine don't lose consciousness. Therefore, microtubules cannot be the seat of consciousness. So I said, Roger, I got this one. It's easy. So my point was, number one, colchicine doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier.
Yes.
So it's not even going to get there. Number two, it only affects microtubules that are actively disassembling and reassembling. And neuronal microtubules don't do that because, at least in dendrites, they're capped at both ends. So they're perfect memory sticks, because each tubulin state in a lattice is going to keep that relationship to its surrounding. If they disassembled and then reformed to something else and came back together, you'd lose all that. So they're capped. And I think that's critical for memory, because we don't really know where memory is. I mean, neuroscience, synaptic proteins, but those synaptic proteins last hours to days, and memories last lifetimes. So it can't be. Microtubule is the perfect place, particularly in dendrites and soma. Anyway, so getting back to this attack piece, so it's not going to be affected because they don't disassemble. And the third, I found a paper where somebody injected colchicine right into the brain of a rat and wiped out the brain, wiped out the rat. So loss of cognition and consciousness. So that part was easy, and some other silly things. And we wrote this rebuttal. And one funny thing is that Pat, I don't know if you know her, but
I've spoken to Pat before on the show.
She can be pretty snide, and at least when it comes to me. And she said at the beginning of the article, I'm attributing this to her, but it goes equally to Grush. But she said they're referring to our theory, which we hadn't even formulated. They said the theory is what did they say? No better than a 1 in a gazillion caterpillar with hookah hypotheses. 1 in a gazillion caterpillar with hookah hypotheses, referring to Alice in Wonderland. And so anyway, at the end of all this, Roger and I, we had to respond, and we said, well, it's not that we're in Wonderland. Perhaps their heads are in the sand. And Roger on the Shakespearean praps, P''RAPS. I said, I went along with that. And then at the very end, the editor, publisher of the Journal of Consciousness Studies, Roger and I were at a meeting at the Fetzer Institute, and we get a fax and said, the publisher wants to include this cartoon that he commissioned for the occasion of your fight with Pat and Rick Rush, and do you approve? And they faxed it over, and it's this. So it's Alice in Wonderland. So on the left is a giant mushroom, toadstool and with a caterpillar sitting on top of it, smoking a hookah. And the caterpillar looks shockingly like me. In fact, it did look like me. And then on the far side is Roger dressed as the White Rabbit holding the keys to the Platonic realm, the door of which is behind him. And in between us are two rather large ostriches with their heads buried in the sand and their butts facing the viewer with G and C for Russian Churchland. And the caterpillar is blowing the hookah smoke right up their butts. So it was kind of a slap at all of us. You know, as far as the article goes, that article came out before our first exposition of the Orca War theory, which came out about 6 months later. So anyway, that came out, and we were criticized and ridiculed right from the start. Everybody knows the brain's too warm, wet, and noisy for quantum effects. Blah, blah. You don't need microtubules. All these silly arguments. And I mean, the decoherence, the warm temperature was a valid one, because if you want a quantum computer in the technology, you have to do it at absolute zero temperature.
Yes.
But our attitude at that point, we didn't have any evidence either way, was that biology had billions of years to evolve a mechanism, and this would certainly be beneficial. So, and I also knew about that the anesthesia acts by quantum forces, and that's all. They don't form chemical bonds at all. Let me switch to anesthesia a second, because as I said, it's the best way to figure out anesthesia.
Yeah.
To figure out consciousness. If you figure out what goes away. So the first thing, it's a bit paradoxical, because the anesthetics don't form chemical bonds. They have these very weak van der Waals forces that are quantum interactions, because they have filled electron outer shells. Or, for example, xenon. Xenon is an element, a noble gas. It's one atom, and the outer electrons are filled, and so it doesn't form any chemical bonds. But if you have two of them together, the electron cloud in this one repels the electron cloud in this one, so you get a dipole, like a little magnet. So you have a dipole here and a dipole here, and then they attract and couple, and then they oscillate. And anything at that level will oscillate with these van der Waals forces, will oscillate in terahertz, which is infrared. And that includes aromatic rings like benzene ring and phenyl rings and indole rings, and like tryptophan and all the psychedelics. They all have the indole ring. And in fact, almost all psychoactive molecules are aromatics. So they have this benzene, which has these pi electron resonance and has quantum optical effects. So they're fluorescent. And I knew about fluorescence because I had done a project on actually when I was a resident on fluorescence, anesthetic effects on fluorescence of proteins from rat brain. And I showed an effect, but I'm not sure it ever got published. It was kind of an amateurish thing, but that basic idea of anesthetics affecting quantum optical states was spot on. But anyway, because we've done much more since then. But anyway, the aromatic rings are all inside the protein and inside the microtubules, and they form these quantum channels that can go not only within the tubulin, but to the next tubulin, to the next. So you get a mesoscopic or macroscopic length quantum state, which I think it's the only I don't know of any others. Well, I'm sure there are, but I mean, technologically, that'd be hard to do, to make a quantum state that would go a millimeter, for example, in length. But I don't know, maybe it's easier. I mean, lasers do it, but you're always pumping energy. And in biology, we're pumping metabolic energy. Anyway, so we got criticized. Tegmark had this famous stupid argument that microtubules decohere in 10 to the minus 13 seconds. But he made a mistake of 7 orders of magnitude in his calculations, which brought it down to 10 to the minus 6th. We found another mistake, bringing out 10 to the minus 4th. But 10 to the minus 6th is fine, because that's all we need to avoid decoherence. And a bunch of, to be honest, in my opinion, I'm biased, of course, none of these attacks, and there have been a lot of them, have laid a glove on us in boxing terms, or MMA or whatever it is now. And we have a fair amount of supportive data from anesthesia effects on quantum optical states and microtubules. And there's more stuff coming that I can't discuss at this point because I promised my good friend not to say anything. But I'm pretty happy about what the future is going to bring in this in terms of microtubules as the origin of consciousness due to a quantum mechanism.
You touched on quite a few things that I've already made notes about, but you've slowly touched on each one. The quantum coherence, I made a note about that. I mean, obviously, how do you do this within a warm, noisy environment? And you've briefly touched on that. But let's start off by explaining the concept of objective reduction in OR and how it's unique compared to other interpretations of quantum mechanics. And then from there, we can slowly move into microtubule structure, the terahertz that you eventually go into with regards to tubulin, etc.
Okay, objective reduction was Roger's solution to the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. It unifies or connects quantum physics and general relativity, which is another one of those mysteries that he seems to have solved. And he bases it on first formulating a picture, a conceptualization of what superposition is. It'd be nice to understand what we're trying to explain. And his theory is the only one that does that by the space-time separations, as I explained before. So, I mean, he uses these two-dimensional space-time sheets as imagery and illustration, and it was useful to me. I mean, so it takes 3 dimensions of space and converts it to 1, and then 1 dimension of time. So you have evolution of time, and then a particle would be a curvature, and its movement would be the curvature kind of changing directions, that sort of thing. So, and then you can picture superposition, as I said before, of separated curvatures, and were they to separate, they would continue, and each would have its own universe or evolve in its own universe. But he said, no, the separations are, and as they evolve in time, they're unstable, and as they evolve, they reach a time t equals h bar over e sub g. So h bar is the Planck-Dirac constant, the Planck constant over 2 pi, and E sub G is the gravitational self-energy. And this is something I had to try to understand when we first started working on it, because he handed me an equation and he said, please, it was like a homework for a student, which was really kind of cool. And but E sub G is the energy required to pull mass apart from itself. So whether it's, my fist or an atom or a protein like a tubulin, you got to pull it apart in a superposition. And the amount and other properties of that superposition give you E sub G. So the more the superposition, the smaller the T and the faster it'll collapse. So if you can get something very large in superposition, it'll reach threshold essentially almost immediately. Something small, if you had an electron or a proton in superposition would take a long time, 1,000 years maybe. I can't remember the number. But and the larger the superposition, the faster the collapse, the greater. We kind of put this as a supposition, the more intense the experience when the experience occurs. And I should say that when the experience occurs in a random microenvironment, which is most of the time, the experience would be disconnected, random, lacking in context, meaning, and what Roger coined as proto-conscious. And this could be happening everywhere all the time as kind of a background proto-conscious noise. And it would have to be if the theory is correct. And this sounds kind of weird, but on the other hand, people resort to panpsychism, which basically says the same thing, that there's consciousness everywhere attached to matter. But if you attach it to matter, then you have the problem how you combine it into unified conscious thoughts. And how do you go from proto-conscious to conscious? And with quantum, it's easy because you have entanglement. So if you can figure out how they entangle, then you have a unified conscious content that's all. So for example, spatiotemporal binding, you see something moving through the sky, and its shape, color, motion, meaning roughly are processed different parts of the visual cortex moving forward from V1 to the front, and at different times, at different places and different times, and yet you see one object. You see a blue kite or a yellow bird or an airplane or whatever instantaneously. The color, the shape, and that's because of binding. and that's easy if you've got entanglement, which is non-local in both space and time. And neuroscience, cognitive science still doesn't have a good mechanism for that. And they invoke coherent gamma synchrony over the whole brain. And yet it's hard to explain how you can have zero phase lag gamma synchrony over the whole brain even with ephaptic transmission. I mean, certainly not with membrane transmission, particularly with synapses, but even with electrical synapses or ephaptic transmission, because that dies off over quickly with length. The ephaptic does, and so it's hard to explain zero phase lag gamma synchrony. Even if that could explain binding, you'd still have the fact that they're all different all over the place, and okay, they're synchronized, but so what? But if they're entangled, they become part of one conscious entity, one experienced entity. So that's one, yeah. So but you want to know about OR per se, and let me just add by saying that the other possibilities. So going back 100 years to Niels Bohr and all those guys, they knew the things would be in superposition. They knew when they measured them, they were not in superposition; they were in definite states. Some people said, well, the wave function collapses. And then later, Everett said, well, everyone has its own possibility. And Bohr basically says, I don't want to know about it. Just make the measurement and we'll use the results. And so he didn't care about the reality. And of course, Einstein differed with that and wanted to know about the reality. And that kind of discussion, debate between Einstein and Bohr was played out between Roger and Anton Zeilinger. And Zeilinger won they both won the Nobel Prize since that time. And I was in a meeting in Lucerne, the Swiss biennial, run by Rene Stetler, and a good friend of mine. And he had Zeilinger and Roger, and they had this fantastic debate about this. And it spilled over to the dinner, and it was just so enjoyable. And they're both such great guys. But anyway, he was kind of in the camp, well, let's just do the entanglement. Of course, he won a Nobel Prize, so you can't argue with that. But Roger's interested in what really goes on. And the other explanation was consciousness per se caused the collapse or reduction. And well, first it was measurement like a machine. And then Wigner had this idea, well, no, it has to be consciousness, because even in the machine, the results can be in superposition. We don't really know. So that came along with the idea that the consciousness causes collapse of the wave function that even Chalmers has embraced now. It's hard to understand why, but for one thing, it doesn't explain consciousness. It leaves it as a complete mystery. Number two, it doesn't explain how, if you observe the conscious observer, it's basically telepathy, because you're observing a system it's not attached to directly, and it's not like the photon's going this way, or maybe unless they're coming out, or there's some action at a distance of consciousness. And we know that that actually this does appear to happen in the double slit experiment, so it can't be totally wrong. So anyway, so there's the conscious observer, then there's decoherence, any interaction with the environment. But the environment, the microenvironment, is also going to be quantum. And so I think environmental interactions could actually be a form of objective reduction, because you have the E sub G of the system and you have the E sub G of the environment, and they add up and they reach threshold and you have a collapse, except it's random because it's in a random microenvironment. So decoherence might be a different form of, well, actually the same form of objective reduction. I'm not sure physicists agree with me, but it seems to me that objective reduction could explain all of it. And so we had that's decoherence and multiple worlds. We'd say objective doesn't happen because there's a collapse before.
Yes.
And one interesting thing was that these actually Hartmut Nevin and David Deutsch has been saying this for a long time, that the quantum computers prove that there must be many worlds, because they say the number of calculations that needs to be done in one of these quantum supremacy experiments is so vast that it would require an infinite number of universes. And I find that difficult to believe, but I can't disprove it, except to say that in Roger's view, you have these localized superpositions with it could be more than many possibilities, but here, there, and everywhere, doing more local without being integrated. So it's kind of like localized versions of many worlds to take advantage of that without saying goodbye to reality in this world. So I think to me, a non-physicist and one who's definitely biased because I'm rather fond of Roger and found also that he's always been right. I can't think of anything he's really been wrong about. And
do you feel that that dichotomy between the many worlds or the Copenhagen interpretation, this sort of dichotomy sort of adds to this, let's say, critique from others, because there's a chance that if this goes down the other path, then you guys are completely wrong.
Completely wrong? If it goes down
the many worlds, yeah.
Yeah, actually, and that's really relevant right now because Hartmut Neven and Christoph Koch have come out with this idea that consciousness occurs due to quantum effect but it occurs when the superposition forms at the beginning of the superposition before it reaches any threshold, because according to them there is no threshold. So Hartmut's a good friend of mine, but I have to really disagree with this because as I told him, they say if you put it in the superposition, you haven't come to any conclusion, but let's say, okay, he said, well, it's at the very beginning of the superposition, which is kind of cheating, but it's kind of like you're looking at the possibilities. It's kind of like if you go to a restaurant and you're deciding what to have for lunch and you look at the menu and you're going to have A, B, C, D, or E, and I'm going to have C, a hamburger, but he's going to have all of them because he's saying consciousness is in the superposition. So it doesn't make any sense unless I guess his answer would be, well, you choose the hamburger in the universe that you go off to. So anyway, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think it's a way of maybe justifying the quantum computation, but I don't think they need to do that. At least not human consciousness.
Stuart, what are your thoughts on some of the other quantum theories of consciousness? I know if you think about Robert Lawrence Kuhn's landscape of consciousness, he's got you there. He's got you in your theory, and then there are other people like, let's say, John Joe McFadden with the semi-field theory. You've got other quantum biologists, let's say, working on this, but from a different perspective. Do any of their theories of consciousness intrigue you, or do you find that objective reduction, OKR, has just got it going, and that's the one?
They all intrigue me, and I check them all out, and I think we're better than. Of course, I'm biased, but I'm also I've also run the Science of Consciousness conference for 31 years.
Yes.
So I've seen them all, and I've known almost all. But you mentioned John Joe, and he is a quantum biologist, but the semi theory I don't think is particularly quantum. It's electromagnetic field theory, and there are a lot of those now. And and electric fields can shape the cytoskeleton, actually. But when they say that, my question would be, what's the frequency of the field you're looking at? Because I think the fields they're talking about are oscillating, or some fields in there are oscillating. And we know from Honorbon's work that they're oscillating at multiple scales. And so, for example, you may have oscillation at the gamma, 40 hertz oscillation. Okay, that's a field. So that's one. But if you look at smaller, faster inside, which Honorbon has done, so you see activity in hertz, like in EEG, 40 hertz. But you also see activity in kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz, every 3 orders of magnitude. And he's traced this to the microtubules, or he found it in microtubules. So basically, the initial experiments were if you take a microtubule and he actually looked at it in 3 different scales, but starting at the middle scale, and you attach electrodes to it at either end, and then four more. You use 2 to stimulate and 2 to record. Now, if you just put a voltage across the microtubule, it's an insulator. But if you put an alternating voltage, an alternating current, and you will find certain frequencies when it becomes highly conductive, like almost a superconductor. And when it does that and plot the resonance, you get a particular pattern, which is the same every 3 orders of magnitude. It's a triplet pattern, and each triplet peak has 3, so it's a triplet of triplets. And you see that in kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz, and in microtubules, and also in tubulins, even in the individual tubulins, and even coming from cells. So it's all kind of coupling together, and now you can measure it from the scalp an EEG, or what he calls DDG, for dodecanography, for 12 orders of magnitude. So, and we've done some preliminary experiments with megahertz, and some more of that is coming out hopefully soon. And I think it's pretty exciting. Looking at effects. Well, I'm not going to say. I promise. That. But
have you and Roger made an agreement? You have to wait. Do we have to wait for it?
What's that?
You and Roger, you've made a pact. Let's keep this a secret until it's all.
Oh, it wasn't Roger. No, Honorbon.
Okay, I see.
He's the experimentalist.
Stuart, so when I think about theories of consciousness, something I like to explore on this channel is, what are the philosophical implications of this theory? So there's many ways we can go into this. With Orch-OR, what would you say are some of the philosophical implications on, let's say, the hard problem itself and the concept of free will?
Well, the hard problem itself, we fall back on consciousness experience being fundamental. And so we're dealing at the level of space-time geometry, the Planck scale. And, a lot of people are trying to ascribe it to something in physics to make a connection between the brain and consciousness and the universe in some way. In fact, that's a major theme of our conference in Spain, in Barcelona in July, the Science of Consciousness. And basically, this connection between the quantum effects of the brain and fundamental space-time. And we have not only Roger, who started this all off, but Federico Fagin and Nassim Haramein and a bunch of other, Don Hoffman, and a bunch of other people. So it's going to be pretty cool, because we're actually going to take this seriously and say, okay, how is there a connection? Roger's objective reduction was the first, but Nassim, he and his team are seem to be finding triplets in space-time. So that would be an amazing connection. And Honorbon will be there too, of course. I didn't mention him, but he's also, by the way, can I talk about? He's building a self-organizing quantum computer in India, and other people are doing that too. But I think he started it. And warm temperature, self-organizing, organic quantum computer. So we'll be hearing about that at the conference, and also about his other amazing stuff. Checking megahertz. So, so things are good in microtubule Orch-OR land. I think, even though the rest of the world hasn't figured it out yet, I think there's a little suppression and politics. I think, AI is again. Okay, the multiple worlds people are against this, because that would invalidate them, because you can't have multiple worlds in Orch-OR. AI is against us because we're kind of undermining the idea that the brain is a complex computer of simple neurons, and therefore an AI can be conscious, because it's the same thing. It's a complex arrangement of simple on-off switches, and ignoring the fact that it's biology, and we don't know what life is. I mean, we still don't know what life is. And I'd like to come back to that, because that's what I'm doing now in astrobiology, searching for the origin of life. But as far as Orch-OR, you asked about the philosophical implications. So the hard problem by connecting us to the fundamental level of the universe, which is also spiritual, and it kind of addresses, our place in the universe and who we are, which I think would be good to know. And if you're a computationalist, you pretty much accept the fact that consciousness is epiphenomenal and merely along for the ride, and comes too late to do anything anyway, at least for real-time stuff. But there's a trick to that, and the backward time effects, which we can come back to. But the other thing is that I've been embroiled in lately is one potential implication is in near-death and out-of-body experiences, and even afterlife and reincarnation, which is I've been fighting about online lately. And because so I think that consciousness occurs in this scale invariant hierarchy, and a lot of people have brain models of a hierarchical system, starting with the neuron as a fundamental, yes, on-off switch, and then going upward in size, to slower and slower, larger and larger, and then in EEG, and then maybe the Schumann resonance or something like that. But I think the real hierarchy is going the other way, going smaller deeper, faster inward. And because you have microtubules in every cell, and they have these same resonance triplet patterns, and you see these at the scalp or actually all over the body because there's microtubules everywhere. You see them best over the brain and also at joints where there's a lot of osteoclast and osteoblast activities in the microtubules in the bone. But so it can happen at these various frequencies, including as you go faster and faster with the triplets. You can actually get faster and smaller than biology, and then even matter, even mass, because if Roger's right, this has to go all the way down to the Planck scale. And so in biologically, we go to 10 to the minus 10 to the 15th hertz, and the Planck scale is 10 to the 43. So that's a big step. But this is where Nassim Haramein and his group come in, because they're looking at the structure or the geometry of space-time. And if they're hinting that they may be seeing these triplets all the way down, which would be pretty amazing. And so the microtubules resonate to some frequency pattern that goes all over the universe. And this self-repeating frequency pattern is Anirban calls it a time crystal. And time crystals I've been learning about recently and trying to learn about. And they were actually a time crystal is something that repeats in a time domain with a frequency. So a spatial crystal, salt or a diamond, anything, it just repeats periodically in space. And so you have a crystal lattice in space, spatially. In a time crystal, you have a system that may extend its space, but it has frequencies that repeat at different scale. Or sorry, the same patterns repeat at different scales. And so like in a microtubule in kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, terahertz, and maybe all the way down. Now, actually, technically a time crystal is only at one frequency, but there's something called a polyatomic time crystal that can be at multiple frequencies. And so that's what Anirban's talking about. And polyatomic time crystals in microtubules, which could be a key feature of life, because one thing life needs. So why would we want this? Well, one thing, we transcend scale. So things that have information at the molecular level can be instantly transmitted to the macro level. So for consciousness, that's exactly what you need. It may have something to do with the hologram too, but I can't quite figure that out yet. But we're getting there, because I think the hologram is actually a pretty good model too. But the polyatomic time crystal may turn out to be an important discovery that Anirban made in biology. So it was first proposed for biology in a general way, but not in a quantum way, by Art Winfrey in the 1960s. And then Frank Wilczek, who won a Nobel Prize for something else, proposed them in physics, but you have to pump them and he proposed that in 2012. And I think somebody just did that. It had like 40 minutes of activity after you pump it in a technological device. But we're saying it's a quantum system that starts in the ground state, where the oscillator is in the ground state. And so it's kind of as I was criticized by Lee Cronin, because he said, well, it's a perpetual motion machine. And I said, yeah, but so is life, and so that's where we're at right now. Time crystals polyatomic time crystals may turn out to be quite important.
So how would sorry, continue, Stuart?
I just want to finish that point, which is that if you get fast enough with these oscillations, consciousness can still occur by time t equals h bar over e sub g. But if the e gets bigger and bigger as you go faster and faster, t gets smaller. Well, the t gets smaller, so you get more entanglement, and you could, in principle, your consciousness could be non-local and quite literally leave the body and exist in space-time geometry. And so I think, I don't claim any evidence for out of body or, life after death or consciousness after death or out of body or reincarnation, but I don't think they're impossible. I think they're plausible. If consciousness is non-local in space-time, then any of this is possible. And as you know, it's been in most cultures and religions forever, these kinds of phenomena, and they're pretty good descriptions. for reincarnation, even these kids who get interviewed have birthmarks at the site of the trauma that they killed the person they appear to be reincarnating. So I think all of that is potentially on the table. Although whoever leads that charge is going to get slapped back, and I, I I think it's anyway. It's something that can be discussed now.
Yeah, it's like it sort of opens the door to new research in the future. Because one of the questions I was going to eventually touch on was, as an anesthesiologist, you've been exposed throughout your life, with cases where someone's in a coma, someone's under anesthesiology, or someone's getting operation done. Because how would this affect our view on someone who's alive, let's say, in a coma, dead? So this definitely has certain practical implications now as well.
Yeah, I've had a slight disagreement with Honor on it, and many of my Eastern friends, because they think that, I said, well, consciousness goes away under anesthesia. No, you can't. He said, it can't go away. And then I say, well, okay, well, proto-conscious experience is everywhere. It doesn't go away. So no, they wouldn't accept that. And let's just say we'll have data on that soon. Exactly what happens under anesthesia, but I'm not allowed to. I can't. That's a bit of a story. But the point is that Orca gives a plausibility argument for reincarnation and even afterlife. Who knows?
When you were practicing anesthesiology full time, how was that approach during your clinical practices? Did it affect the way you worked and how other anesthesiologists perceived you? Because you're now talking about things that obviously I know a lot of doctors don't tend to enjoy engaging.
I mean, philosophical discussions about consciousnesses. Some did and some didn't, and some of them were really into it. They knew me and something. But actually, I was better known for other things in the OR, like the same jokes every case and stuff like that. That had nothing to do with my research.
So it really impacted the way. Well, obviously, I know, because this is my favorite hobby, talking about the mind-body problem consciousness. But it doesn't really, I would say, filter too much into the clinical practice. So I can understand you being in theater, completely zoning in on the case, not really.
Right. I mean, basically, avoid hypoxia, hypotension, dysrhythmias, keep them warm, and the same way as you got them. It's a big job, and I did it for 49 years. I mean, I was supervising residents and CRNAs most of the time, but I did a lot of my own cases, and I tell you, looking back, I loved it. It was grueling, intense, it was stressful a lot of the time, but very rewarding because you take care of patients. It's different from your kind of general practice, family practice, where you build a relationship with people over time. And some people say, well, you miss, you don't get that. But when somebody comes in for surgery, they're usually scared, anxious, and as my first chairman says, you make your first eye contact is more important than 10 milligrams of Versed. You know that you're empathetic but confident. You're not scared. You may be concerned and worried. Anyway, so stuff like that. But I didn't have any near death or out of body experiences in my patients. Then awareness under anesthesia. That was the point I was getting to. I mean, that's something that you want to avoid also, because there have been these cases of awareness under anesthesia, and I was good at leaning a little bit heavily on the anesthesia as long as it was safe. I mean, it's pretty good safety. But anyway, yeah, I had a good career. Let's just leave it at that, and I enjoyed it very much.
On that note, though, scales of consciousness. How does OR account for the spectrum of consciousness from the basic sensory awareness, just like what you're talking about now, in terms of awareness under anesthesia? How would this differ?
Well, as I was saying, we have this scale invariant hierarchy, and consciousness can occur anywhere along it. It's kind of like a musical scale, like sheet music even, which I don't understand, but well, a little bit. But so in fact, I think consciousness is a lot like music, and it can occur at different frequencies. The OR events themselves are like notes or chords occurring across multiple scales, or one scale that maybe bouncing back and forth, kind of like music, resonating. It can be harmonic or anharmonic, and it's a time progression. So you have chords, and it just moves along, and that, except it's not just sound, it's everything else also. So so it quite literally is a spectrum given by T equals H bar over E sub G. And so the time can vary, and so it's a lot like photons. So that's why we figured that the high intensity, high frequency, large superposition mass must have the most experiential intensity, and but regardless of the content. And it also relates to other organisms, including animals and plants, because plants have microtubules. So I have a graph somewhere of plotting the number of tubulins versus the intensity in different species. Starting with, I don't know, I still don't know whether whales and elephants have more microtubules or not, but starting with us and going down to a plant which might have 100 microtubules, whereas we have well, I should put it in tubulins because we can count the tubulins. Might have like 1,000 tubulins per cell, whereas we have 1 billion per cell. And depending on and we have 10 to the, if you want to count glia, we have 10 to the 20th tubulins in the brain, and which, by the way, is the most abundant protein in the brain. So if you want to, if somebody asks you, well, what's the brain made of, and you say, well, neurons, but structurally or or molecularly, tubulin would be the answer. Microtubules would be the answer. The brain is more made of tubulin than anything else. And yet microtubules are particularly ignored, are completely ignored generally. You know, I once asked a famous neuroscientist, Rodolfo Linas, he's old timer, at some dinner. I said, about microtubules. I said, don't you? He said, you know, I see them all the time. They're just laying there. They're just sitting there. I said, you want them to wave at you? What do you want them to do? I mean, you know, if you look at a computer, is it like doing anything unless you turn it on? So anyway, yeah, they get ignored, but they need to be kind of quiet and left alone to do their quantum thing.
One of the things I appreciate is the way you look at the complexity of a cell in itself, because when you think of every cell, a single neuron is so complicated, and you tend to highlight this point that you can't just take all that information, that complexity, and just put it into a bit. And then you refer to them as cartoon neurons, which I find very funny, especially when I watch your ex having your debates. How did you come to that idea, the cartoon neuron?
Well, it goes back to okay. At the first Tucson Consciousness Conference, the Science of Consciousness in 1994 in Tucson that I organized, I invited Christoph Koch. He was well known even then. He'd worked with Francis Crick, and Francis Crick had written this book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, which basically said that the brain is basically a bunch of computer of neurons. And it's kind of amazing because Crick had, you know, worked on the very refined DNA problem of looking at information at the molecular level, submolecular level. And when it came to neurons, it was like, you know, it's a 1 or a 0. I was like kind of surprised by that. And then he teamed up with Christoph. I don't know who influenced who into that. But by the way, at this first, I'll come back to Christoph in a second, but the same conference where Dave Chalmers gave the same as hard problem talk, which was great, actually. And the first two philosophers were boring as hell. And he got up and jazzed the room, and the hard, now that's why we're here. Now we get it. And kind of brought all the interdisciplinary aspects together. But at Christoph's talk, he showed a picture of a neuron that was just the membrane, the synapse, you know, inputs on the dendrite, integrate to a firing at the threshold, at the AIS, they call it now, and a firing or not, and 1 or 0. And firings mediate consciousness. He just made up that flat out statement. And but so I was chairing a session, and I said, Christoph, let me ask you something. Your neuron, you still have the picture up. It's empty. There's nothing inside of it. And I said, why don't you look at the microtubules, all their information processing? And he said, Stu, calls me Stu. He says, Stu, I'm going to answer as my favorite cowboy Western actor, Clint Eastwood. And that is to say, a man's got to know his limitations. And apparently this is a line from Magnum Force or something like that. And it was a good comeback because it kind of got me back on my heels, and everybody laughed. And I'm not, what were we laughing at? He completely avoided the question. And I said, so all you can handle is the membrane. He goes, yeah, that's right. So that has persisted for 30 freaking years. And because it plays perfectly into the AI story that AI can be conscious because the neuron's just an on-off switch, an integrated fire threshold logic device, which that was his position. It's still his position. So then he had to bring in panpsychism and this and that, and the way I think. But anyway, the whole neuron, yeah. So recently, and then okay, so jump ahead 20 years or 25 years, I can't remember. So Templeton had this big project on adversarial collaboration and consciousness studies with the different theories, and they had five original theories. Five theories to start with. So IIT, integrated information theory, that Christoph had glommed onto with Giulio Tononi and Chalmers. The three of them pushed it and made it according to them, the leading theory. And despite no evidence, no biology. I'm digressing here because you're giving me the opportunity. And I said, Dave, this is about 10 years. I said, Dave, why is IIT the leading theory? He goes, because leading people say so. I'm going, you and Christoph and Giulio? He goes, yeah. I said, oh, okay. The Legion of Charming Accents. I got it. So when we tried to have an adversarial collaboration. So anyway, we were invited into the let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself. So Templeton invited five theories: IIT, global neuronal workspace, recursive process, predictive coding, recursive processing, higher order thought, and us, OR. And all the others are based on neurons as simple neurons. And we had a meeting with Giulio and Christoph, and we couldn't come to an agreement. I said, well, what we want to do is we want to demonstrate a quantum effect in a microtubule and show it goes away with anesthesia. That's our experiment. And they go, okay, fine. Well, let's do it in the brain of a live awake monkey, and then we'll put the monkey to sleep. I'm going, you don't understand. This has never been done before. It needs to be on an optical table with no vibration, lasers lined up perfectly. You can't do it in a monkey that's moving around and then put the damn monkeys. No. And besides that, it's totally cruel. And so it broke down. But so we never did the experiment. And those experiments all cost $5 million when they actually did it, because they had all these patients. And the experiments did get done for them. But Templeton gave us money just to do our experiment. They gave us $100,000 to do the experiment we did at Princeton, in Greg Scholl's lab with Arat Kalra and Jack Tusinski. And basically, we demonstrated a quantum effect, ambient temperature, and a microtubule with fluorescence. You hit it with UV light, and an excitation propagates along the microtubule, but farther than it should have by classical, so it was therefore quantum. And then we gave it two types of anesthetic: etomidate, which is a liquid anesthetic, and a gas, isoflurane, and both of them took it away and inhibited the propagation, both the time and the distance. So our experiment worked. None of the other experiments that they spent $30 million on have produced anything that I can tell. It's just been a big. This came up at the last Tucson conference in Tucson. We had a 30-year. The closing session was a 30-year reminiscence with Christoph, me, Dave, and Sue Blackmore got on there somehow, even though
I'm chatting to Sue in about a week's time.
Who?
Wait, was this the same one where Christoph gave Dave his bottle of wine, or his crate of wine?
No. That was the ASSC conference.
I see.
That really pissed me off, I got to admit. Okay. Because as I just said, our experiment worked. None of the other experiments showed anything. The big global neuronal workspace IIT thing was inconclusive, completely inconclusive. And none of the others have shown anything. And that cost $5 million. For $100,000, they got a beautiful experiment that nobody knows about. And the reason that nobody knows about it, because at the ASSC conference, in New York, which Dave ran, so there are two conferences, ASSC and the Science of Consciousness. I run the Science of Consciousness, ASSC, and we're not on good terms. Let's just be honest about it. And that's because of Anirban and I have submitted work, the last 3 ASSC on megahertz EEG, and they've been rejected. They don't want it. They don't want to know about it. And so at the including the one at New York that Dave ran, and they had made a bet 25 years ago. Christoph had said by 25 years we would know the neurocortical consciousness, and Dave said no, we won't. And Christoph had to admit no, we don't. We don't. He gave him a case of wine or whatever. And Christoph told me privately later, he says, I could have said that your experiment did show neurocorrelative kind, but I didn't think it's quite there yet. I'm going, and then and they made this big deal about it. It was all over, and then what's his name? John Horgan wrote an article about it in Scientific American, and he asked Dave. He said, "Well, why didn't you consider the quantum theories, quantum approaches?" And he said they're too fringy for this conference. So he said despite him saying that to solve consciousness you need something really, really bizarre, and nothing is strange enough yet. But we're too strange. So and then then he came out in favor of AI being inevitably conscious. So I probably said too much already.
Tell me, do you think it's just purely because of this mystery behind quantum mechanics at this point? Because at this point, I would say that people are a lot more receptive to different theories. There's a lot more panpsychist theories out there. There are a lot more idealist theories out there. I've spoken to Federico and Don Hoffman, and initially when you see how they started out, how many people were against it, you can slowly see people slowly becoming more receptive towards it. Have you felt that this is at least happening towards you guys?
Yeah, but it's still divisive. I mean, like I said, maybe I'm paranoid, or maybe I just like to fight with people. But I think AI is suppressing. I mean, not maybe intentionally directly, but they fund a lot of cartoon neuron labs. Places that would never ever in a million years consider looking at microtubules or higher frequency. I think they're all going to be. I'm not worried about it, because I think I keep hinting at results that we'll have within the next year. So.
I'll definitely, once those come out, I'm going to put links to those in this video, but I'm looking forward to that. What would you say are some of the ethical implications that OR might raise, especially concerning potential altering of consciousness, maybe through pharmaceuticals or technology, because that's rapidly evolving?
Well, if we understand consciousness, we ought to be able to treat its problems. I mean, for example, Alzheimer's is an important. It's not quite the same. I'll come back to your question about altering consciousness, because obviously Alzheimer's is more about memory, but it also does affect consciousness eventually. There are 2 lesions in Alzheimer's, and the amyloid plaques that everybody, the drug companies spend billions, if not trillions, on to develop these drugs, none of which work. They're toxic. They cause bleeding. They cost $40,000 a patient per year. They don't do shit. Pardon my French. The other lesion are the neurofibrillary tangles inside neurons that are from tau protein. Tau is a microtubule associated protein. So in normal healthy conditions, it's attached on the microtubule lattice at particular lattice points, and in fact is a signal for where the motor proteins, which walk along the microtubules, deliver synaptic cargo, synaptic plasticity, jump off and deliver their cargo. Because otherwise, how are they going to know which synapse needs what? So there has to be. So it's encoding of the tau on the microtubule is the memory code, and that are one aspect of it, and that tells the motor proteins where to boost that particular synapse. So if the microtubules disassemble, the tau falls off. It's got nowhere to go. Or the tau also stabilizes the microtubules, so it might get hyperphosphorylated and then fall off, and that destabilizes the microtubules. Which of those scenarios is not clear, but in both cases, in either case, what we see is that the tau forms these clumps, neurofibrillary tangles, and they're a pathognomonic of Alzheimer's disease. More so than the amyloid plaques. And more importantly, or equally importantly, the microtubules disassemble. They fall apart. So if your, God forbid, bones were to fall apart, dissolve, shrivel up and you'd be on the floor, right? Nothing holding you up. That's what happens on the neurons. You lose the synapses because, they're not connected to the neuron anymore. And the axon retracts, the dendrites retract, the neuron shrinks and the brain shrinks. You get cerebral atrophy and you lose memory, you lose cognition. Eventually, you lose consciousness. So the amyloid plaques probably have very little to do with it in the real time. They may cause something that, but in a paper came out in 1989 from UCLA, Matsuyama and Jarvik, microtubules or hypothesis, microtubules the key to Alzheimer's disease. And they pointed out everything I just said. And I thought, great. But yet everybody kept, beating the dead horse of these stupid amyloid plaques. And including some good friends of mine who are, in that field. So, okay, well, what do we do about if it's the microtubules, what do we do about it? Well, when I read about Anirban's work I first met him in 2010, I think, and learned about all this, I said, okay, so microtubules have kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, terahertz resonance vibrations. Maybe we can use those frequencies to boost their activity, to treat them, maybe to improve mood, maybe to make you feel good. So I went through it. So kilohertz is too much like electricity. Megahertz is radio waves. Gigahertz is microwaves. Terahertz is photons. So I said, well, no, I wasn't eager to do any of that into a person. But then I realized that megahertz is also ultrasound. And I looked over, I was at the hospital, and there's an ultrasound machine sitting there. I said, I wonder if anybody's ever put ultrasound in the brain. And so I looked it up, and I found that a guy at ASU, our kind of arch rival university right up the road here, a really good guy named Jamie Tyler, had been doing it in animals and finding physiological effects. He had implanted electrodes and then ultrasounded from the outside and see electrical activity, or he could stimulate the motor cortex and this paw would move and so forth. So he was seeing physiological effects. And I also discovered that it was approved for imaging of the brain, but before CT and MRI came along. So which are much better, but it was used and still used on newborns through the fontanelle where there's no skull bone to look for bleeds. So if a baby's not right neurologically, think they might have had a bleed, they look through the fontanelle and you can see the top of the cortex for like 30 minutes at a time. So I figured it can't be that harmful and it might be helpful. Who knows? So anyway, I used to run the chronic pain clinic, and so I knew a little bit about chronic pain, and the patients are all depressed. Not all, but most of them. And so I said to my anesthesia colleagues, including the ones running the pain clinic, I said, we should try giving ultrasound to our pain patients and see if they get better from their depression. And they go, yeah, right, Hammer. That was my name in anesthesia, Hammer, as if I put him to sleep with a hammer. You go, yeah, Hammer, great. Your idea, you go first. You got a nice shaved head. We'll watch. And so they called my bluff. And so at the end of a long day, I was sitting around the conference room, wielding an ultrasound machine, and they're all sitting around watching me. And so I put the goop on here, and I turned the thing on, and I hold it in my head like this for about 15 seconds. I had no idea how I wanted to keep it there. And I didn't feel a damn thing. And I put it down. I said, well, that's too bad. I was hoping that would, give me some kind of buzz or something. But about a minute later, sure enough, I got a buzz, and I was kind of buzzed for about an hour, 2 hours. I was like very creative, energetic. I felt really good. And so I said, okay. So anyway, we did the study, and it came out in early 2013. The first study of ultrasound on human mental states, and we called it transcranial ultrasound, TUS, which is also the airport code for Tucson. Now, other people have tried to there's been a ton of work since then. Neuroscientists love it because you can focus the ultrasound on any particular brain part. So if you want to stimulate posterior cingulate cortex or this or that, you can do it. The study I did was unfocused. It was scanning, actually, get the whole brain. And there's an advantage to that too. So in 2015, these people in Australia found that it improved. They had a model of Alzheimer's in rats, and they were trying to get a drug, but it didn't cross the blood-brain barrier. They want ultrasound at medium dose opens the blood-brain barrier and drugs get across. And they had a control group where they got the ultrasound, but not the drugs, and they got better from their Alzheimer's got better. So they published this and said, wow, we should do that. And we actually did a pilot study, and I'm trying to get a study going, and looks like we're finally going to get it. But in the meantime, I just did a literature review. Amazing number of studies have shown beneficial effects of, well, it's not it's like maybe 5 to 10, but all of them are beneficial. And one of them this is all in the last couple of years. And one of them actually showed reversal of cerebral atrophy, that the brain actually grew back. And the only way I can explain that is that you're stimulating the microtubules to repolymerize, and that would do it. So we're trying to, I think, and why isn't everybody doing this? Well, nobody's gonna get rich with this, because you can use a handheld ultrasound device that costs $150, as opposed to a drug company $40,000 a year. So, that's it. So
we live in a time where you can literally connect your cell phone to an ultrasound literally from your phone to the brain. So it would be too cost effective.
Yeah, well, actually, the butterfly device is used in ambulances or emergency room to quick ultrasound, and it's just a probe, and you use your phone to read it out. So yeah, but you need the ultrasound probe. So
yes,
anyway, we're trying to get that study done, because my dream is kind of like these memory care centers where they have like hundreds of patients in rooms, would be to go from room to room with their informed consent and the cooperation of everybody, go from room to room and give everybody ultrasound, and maybe a couple times they could come back, a couple times a day, try it. And from the anecdotal report, well, they're more than anecdotal. From the reports I've seen so far, they do get better.
Considering the historical context of OR and the way people have perceived it, critiqued it, and the reception it's received, I can tell how passionate you are about it at the moment. What is the legacy you wish that this theory will leave in the field of consciousness? And what areas of research, except for what you're currently doing and you can't tell us about, do you feel people should branch out into and explore more?
Well, quantum biology in general. I think there's going to be a lot more things having to do with quantum biology. I guess my main legacy would be anesthesia, because I went into this because of my first chairman, Bernell Brown. I told you that I was kind of lost. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I moved to Tucson, and I was going to be a neurologist. And I went over to the pain clinic. I was doing an internship, and I'm anesthesiologist. I talked to you about this. He said, "You go talk. Don't talk to me." He says, "I have no idea what you're talking about. Go talk to Bernell. He's the chair of anesthesia at the brand new medical school." I said, "Okay." He said, go to this pain clinic. You'll have a chance to talk to you. So I did. And I hung out with him, and we talked about pain and stuff because I had interest. And I told him about consciousness and microtubules, and he was really interested. So he got me into it. He handed me this paper about, I told you about anesthesia microtubules. And he said, figure out how anesthesia works. That would come from this department. That would be great. And the field of anesthesiology. So, but it's caused me to think about it, because when I first talked about anesthesia, a way to understand consciousness, with Christoph, it was actually, I said, Christoph, we should try to figure out how, despite our arguments, we're actually friends. Same with Jay. I love Dave. I love both those guys, although I'm kind of pissed at both of them at the moment. But I said, we got to figure out how anesthesia works. And he said, it's too nonspecific. It binds all over the body to everywhere. It's in fat stores, it's in proteins, it's in membranes, it's in lipid, it's everywhere. How's that going? I said, yeah, but it's highly selective. It only affects consciousness and nothing else. And he said, yeah, but it's too nonspecific. So that's where it ended. But it was a valid objection. That's a paradox. And about a few months ago, actually, anyway, not long ago, I think I figured it out. The anesthesia binds by these non-specific quantum forces. They go and they bind to everything. And yet the only thing they're affecting is consciousness. Why? The answer is only consciousness has highly organized or orchestrated quantum processes. They're totally in sync. All the other ones are all random. So the anesthesia comes in and randomizes and turns and only affects consciousness, which has this highly organized, orchestrated quantum processes. Everything else is already randomized. So you can't, nothing happens. It's already random. So I think that's the answer. And I told Christoph that. He goes, "Oh, okay."
You didn't mention how you got to that cartoon neuron, by the way.
Well, it was based on Christoph's slide at the
I
1994
see. So
conference.
it was based on that.
But it didn't come to me until after this stupid bet thing. And when he goes, "Yeah, we don't have a neural correlate of consciousness," when he could have said that our experiment worked, and he didn't. And Dave said that we were too fringy for the ASSC meeting. And I said, I think it was in a tweet or something. It just came to me. I said, "Well, you're just pushing these empty, monotonic, one frequency, empty, inanimate cartoon neurons," and it stuck.
Yeah, I love it when you interact with people on X and you just refer to us to tell me more about your cartoon neurons. It's the best thing to watch.
Well, I do have to explain what I mean by it, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I think I'm pretty. Do you follow me on Twitter?
Yeah, love it. I enjoy your Orca defenses.
Yeah, I can get pretty defensive actually. Fight. I try not to be defensive about it. I try to be open and I try to be good humored and not too sarcastic.
Yeah, no, it's and I think look when you're that passionate about something, it makes sense that you would do this. I often think when I started this podcast, when I had a list of names of all the people I wanted to have on the show when I first started, and I've been fortunate enough to tick them off one by one, and the list has grown over time. But there was an initial group of names, and you were one of those names because I see you and the way you've contributed to this field with the Science of Consciousness conference and all the things that have happened because of that conference and because of all the things you've done in the field, and then obviously yourself and Roger and all the work you've done. It's pretty cool that I get to tick these names off this list. So for me, it's pretty much a privilege to even chat to you guys. So it's like watching my favorite celebrities battle it out in the theories of consciousness world.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Tell me, Stuart, for this next conference, you mentioned Federico, Donald, all these guys coming together. Tell me more about that.
Well, I thought it was, well, first of all, the conference is in Barcelona, and as luck would have it, bad luck, actually, the ASSC conference is at the same time in Greece, which is unfortunate. If they had been a week or two apart, you could have gone to both. And even if I'm unwelcome there, I still might have gone because I've been to Crete, actually. I love the place.
Mm.
But anyway, but I decided that cartoon neurons have had their chance. Let's do, let's embrace the connection to the universe that people have been talking about. Federico talks about it. Don, people you mentioned, but also others, and in different ways. So that's the main theme of the conference. And we also have some really good neuroscience. We have Earl Miller and Matthew Larkham and Sabine Kastner, and then others talking about anesthesia and psychedelics and ultrasound. And Jay Sanguinetti is going to talk about ultrasound, and Giulio Ruffini. So we have pretty good neuroscience too. And I think we go into neuroscience more so than ASSC because they don't. I don't know if it's because they dislike me so much, but they'll stick to cartoon neurons. I wouldn't even go there. Although actually, I think there's. Well, I better not say anything. I don't want to jinx it. Never mind. But anyway, so the connection between quantum brain biology and fundamental physics, cosmology. So that's a major theme, and also from local interest, parapsychology. When I was there so we're combining with this Festival of Consciousness, and they had these kids who who have apparently this telepathy. They're on the telepathy tapes and all that, and I saw them at a different conference I was at. And anyway, we're having a session on that because if ORCOR is correct, then non-locality is possible, and ESP is plausible. And I think the evidence for parapsychology is actually pretty damn good. I mean, it's ridiculed. Well, that's impossible. It can't be right. You can't believe that. It's impossible. That's not impossible if it's quantum. The same thing with Afterlife. It's not impossible if you have quantum non-locality. So there's that, and then uh, um, the other kind of somewhat risky area. I don't think it's that risky. Is these UAPs and UFOs and what the hell they are, and whether they're conscious or not. And so these the ones that I found the most interesting are these plasmoids. They're kind of like a ball lightning, and they do purposeful things. And we're gonna have some talks about that. And I actually did an experiment in the 80s on Kirlian photography and showed that anesthesia inhibits plasma directly, whether you have biology in the picture or not, just the actual plasma count. And so I don't know if that tells us that they could be conscious. So anyway, and we have some other experts on that, and I think that's a really hot area. And then Federico, as you say, and who am I forgetting?
You said Don Hoffman is one of them. Who else?
Avshalom
Mhm.
Elitz.
On this channel, I've chatted to Don, I think over 3 times. I've chatted to Federico once. Their idealist theory of consciousness, do you feel that now that you're more open to now that you've explored your quantum theory of consciousness for so long, that you're more open to idealist philosophies?
Not really. I mean, I debate this with Deepak all the time, and because I believe in reality. I believe in matter, and I think there's a classical world, and then there's a quantum world, and consciousness is on the edge between them. And I kind of sometimes use the yin yang with the quantum and the classical, and consciousness on the edge. And actually, I got that idea from somebody years ago who told me about a lot. It's from the Kabbalah, actually, that there's two worlds, and consciousness dances on the edge between the two. I always like that. So it's kind of it's on the boundary between, and that's what collapse the wave function is. It's on the boundary between quantum and classical.
Yeah, I actually spoke to Hyman Schipper about the Kabbalah and consciousness, and there were some fascinating insights that come from that. I was very surprised as someone not very familiar with the concept at all. It's very intriguing how many ancient cultures had quite a lot to say about these concepts.
Yeah, and a lot of them are very, very similar, very common, and particularly when descriptions of near-death and out-of-body experiences and that sort of stuff. Astral projection, it could be remote viewing.
Mm.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, continue.
No, I think all of this will turn out to be potentially true.
It's quite fascinating territory at this point, because a lot of people who were hard materialists, very much scientific, atheists, non-believers, are slowly coming into this quantum understanding, and then everything sort of just starts afresh. It's almost like you have to clean the slate and start readjusting your worldviews in a way that becomes a little bit more agnostic, because you realize that you actually don't really know as much as you thought you did.
Yeah, and then there's the advent of quantum computers. So if you're a computationalist and believe that the brain's just a classical computer, and now you find out no, the quantum computers are much better than classical computers, then you're going to want the brain to be a quantum computer, and then you have to deal with the same crap you've given us. So we'll see what happens.
It's like a recursive cycle. It's an infinite loop, and it's just going to keep going and going. It will never stop, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. That brings up when did it start? And Roger's other great idea is CCC, that the Big Bang was preceded by another eon, which had another eon before that. So I was at this festival in England, and Scott Aronson, Scott Aronson, you know who he is? Oh, okay. He's a big shot in quantum computing. Anyway, what were we talking about? Oh, I mentioned this going back in time is the solution to the Big Bang problem of like everything all at once from nothing, which is kind of hard to explain. And realizing that you still have to explain where it all. He said, "Yeah, but then you have to go all the way back and you have to deal with that." And I said, just totally spur of the moment. I never thought this thought in my life. I said maybe if you go back far enough, you wind up in the future. And he said, well, then you have to do, and then he realized he was playing into my narrative. So I don't know. I have no idea where that idea came from, but maybe it's true.
At this point, as an astrobiologist as well, trying to figure out this concept of life not on Earth, how does OR play into this? And how are you going through this new part of your career, I would say? Well, relatively.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I'm really enjoying myself. It keeps me going. You know, I'm retired now, and well, other than doing this, I mean, I don't go to the hospital anymore, and so I got to stay. I got to keep my mind active, and this does it, and I enjoy it. I'd be doing it. I'd be doing it for free. I mean, I just loved it. And it's the most interesting thing in the world. So, I keep going.
You've contributed so much already, and now you're obviously doing more. The Science of Consciousness Conference, I'm assuming that's going to keep going. What do you see happening in the next 10 years, Stuart? What do you think is going to be happening in the science of consciousness in the future?
Good question. I hope it keeps going in our way. I'm personally have to think about passing it on and who's going to take over what I've been doing, and so I'm making plans for that with some good friends and colleagues. Dante, Jay Sanguinetti, Tom Bever, people at the university, people elsewhere. So we have some possible contingency plans about the center, and but we hope the conference continues. We hope to put it on some firm standing, so it'll just keep going, becoming somewhat recent. Because I think we're going to keep learning more and more, and it's not going to fall into the the brain is a complex computer of simple neurons. I don't think that's. I mean, otherwise, how do you explain a paramecium that swims around, finds food, finds a mate, has sex, and an amoeba, which is one cell that can solve the traveling salesman problem, with its microtubules reaching out in all these different directions. So I think and I hope that microtubules will be rediscovered. Maybe actually when I'm gone, it'll be a good thing for microtubules, because I think I probably annoyed so many people, and actually Dave Chalmers kind of revealed this unintentionally, that they couldn't stomach it if I was right, because of me personally, because I tend to well, you know how I am.
Yeah.
So,
You're like the microtubule mascot.
okay.
But I mean that in the best, in the most, with high praise. Because I appreciate the work and I love it.
How about Microtubule Maestro?
Okay, that's much better. I think that's more
Okay.
fitting. That could be a thumbnail for a clip I make for this video. Microtubule Maestro in motion. Tell me, Stuart, with one thing I wanted to ask that I forgot to ask you earlier was when you got to work with Sir Roger Penrose, and when he appreciated the work you contributed to the field, how was that for you? Because that must be super exciting as someone who probably looked up to him growing up.
Well, I didn't really know about him growing up until I read his book. I recognized the name, but I didn't really know about him. I mean, I'm not a physicist, although I love physics. And if I hadn't gotten to medical school, I would have gone to physics grad school. But he's a total gentleman. He's very kind. He's very gentle. He's very soft spoken. He can be, if you corner him, he'll bite back, but in a kind of a stiff upper lip British type of way. I wish I was more like him in that way, the way he handles himself with people. I tend to, lose my temper sometime. I kind of react. I kind of blame it sometimes. I'm spending my life in an operating room where, something happens, you can't mess around. You got to take care of it like now, and you can't put up with bullshit. And let's just get this job done. And so that's kind of this is kind of how I don't know if that explains it, but
I think it does, especially as an anesthesiologist. If you in the operating theater, you often take that first lead commander role, and you have to be quite strict. So it makes sense from my perspective, at least as a doctor. So I can see where that comes from. Yeah, but overall, I think that the work you guys are doing is fantastic, and more so what you've done in the past. I mean, the hard problem of consciousness, that infamous line comes from your conference. You've laid out a legacy that I think will never be forgotten. If there's anything I can do with regards to the conference, and by the way, am I invited? Do I get a special invitation for the conference? I'll attend.
sure. Yeah, okay. You can plug it on your podcast.
I will. I definitely will.
Okay.
Dates, everything. I'll put a link. I'll try and get everyone to to come through. I mean, this podcast is pretty much dedicated to the type of work you're doing. So this is in that niche for you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, no.
Thanks for doing.
Stuart, when is the conference exactly? Date, time,
Okay,
location?
July 6th through 11th, and it's immediately followed by that's the Science of Consciousness in Barcelona. It's immediately followed by 11th through 13th, the Festival of Consciousness, which is run by our colleague Javi Ginesta, basically next door. So the same hotel, and so you could come for both. And I think the registration covers both. The festival is more experiential. It's in more of it's in a bigger area with a lot of dancing and yoga and all that kind of stuff. Whereas we're more scientific, although we do have experiential sessions. And like I said, we have a lot of physicists. We have a lot of people talking about the idealist spiritual approach, like Deepak, Federico Bajin, and we got guys talking about monitoring. We have a workshop on the varieties of brain-computer interface, of different ways to interact between the brain, electrical, both in and out, so TMS, but also ultrasound and megahertz EEG, and which I think will be more and more important. We have all the workshops are on Sunday the 6th, and then the plenary start Monday through Friday morning, and then Friday afternoon the festival starts, and we go next door. And the parties Thursday night, we're going to do the same kind of party they have, which is outdoors. It's everything's right on the beach, just a little bit away from the beach. So you got a nice breeze, and there's beautiful outdoor areas, and food trucks and dancing and bars, and that'll be the party. And a poetry slam and zombie blues that we always do.
That sounds absolutely awesome. Stuart, thank you so much for your time. Once again, it's been a privilege and honor to chat to you. I've been looking up to your work and following your journey for quite some time. So it's been an absolute honor for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dev. I appreciate it very much. Great to be on.